Okay. So, hi everybody, I'm Deborah Donnelly, I'm the Executive Director here at AWA. I'm very happy to see you all here. This might be one of our last talks for the winter season, I guess.
We'll go more on Earth Day.
Oh, Earth Day, yes. On Earth Day, we're having a pollinator talk and we'll announce the winners of our photo contest award. So, come on Earth Day to AWA. So welcome. I would really be happy to introduce Guy Greenaway, who's here to give us a talk about conservation easements today. He is the executive director of the Corvus Centre for Conservation Policy. This is a not-for-profit also based in Calgary. And the Corvus Centre uses research, facilitation, and communications to help ensure nature is actively promoted in decision-making. He is a lifelong Albertan and has 25 years of developing tools and managing projects centered on conservation policy, conservation communications, private land conservation, eco-fiscal integration, municipal conservation policy, ecosystem services, and natural infrastructure. That's quite a.
You don't need to read the whole.
So he has chaired the boards of the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation, the Alberta Land Trust Alliance, Small Change Fund, sat on the board of CPAWS South in Southern Alberta, Alberta's chapter of the International Association of Public Participation, worked as the executive director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society and senior project manager for Mistakis, and has run 2 small consulting businesses. He's very busy. And received a BA and a master's in environmental design. I'm very curious about.
He was my decent supervisor.
So a warm welcome for our speaker tonight, Guy Greenaway. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Definitely going to add to my to-do list, make a shorter bio for the next time I do a presentation. It's painful to make people go through that whole thing, but thank you for coming out and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you about this topic. It's a serious topic. It's a challenging topic right now, but also I wanted to kind of have a little bit of fun with it too, because we in the conservation sector tend to sometimes get a little bit overwhelmed by our seriousness. I'm going to talk about conservation easements and the boogeyman, referencing the fact that lately this tool that we've had for 30 years now has started to become scary to some people. And I want to kind of dig into that a little bit and figure out exactly why. The other mystery is why this worked 5 minutes ago when I tested it, but doesn't work now.
It's the gremlins in AWA.
The AWA gremlins. Okay. Let me try to back up. That actually doesn't surprise me because my whole week has been filled with technological disasters.
I can stand there in Florida if you want. Yeah.
Okay, we got it. Okay, just quickly about the Corvus Centre for Conservation Policy. We're relatively new, we've only been around for 5 years. Although I was just joking, all of us behind the Corvus Centre have been around for considerably longer than 5 years. We're a Canadian nature conservation charity. We're based here in Calgary. We work all across Canada. We help government, NGOs, others, anyone who's doing decision-making that has an impact on nature. And our goal is to ensure that there's nature positive policy developed in all of those levels of decision-making. And our vision is that decision-making actively supports biodiversity in all forms. So I thought I would start tonight with talking about a private land conservation mystery. What's going on the last few years? The case of the scary easement. To do that, I'm gonna start by talking about the role of private land conservation. This is actually one of the reasons for the scariness being perceived is we don't talk a lot about private land conservation. We don't share a lot of information about it. I want to talk to you guys about that. I'm going to dig into what is a conservation easement. I'm not going to go too far of a deep dive. If anybody has questions about it, you can ask me later. As my poor long-suffering family will attest to, I can talk for a really long time about conservation easements, but we'll try and keep it brief. This is where we start to get to the mystery part of this, is the growing misconceptions that are happening. And this is probably just in the last 5 years. And like I said, this is a tool that's been around in Alberta for the last 30 years. And then we take kind of a weird twist because we have these perpetual conservation agreements that suddenly they're scary and they're not good and we need to make them temporary and that's going to solve all of our problems. Until I'm not terribly convinced by that. Then I'm going to talk about the mystery solved, what actually happened, what is leading to all of these misconceptions and the odd suggestions of solutions to problems. But probably most importantly, the now what. And some of that's going to apply to land trust. I'll talk about what land trusts are in a second. Some of that will apply to government, but I think mostly it just applies to all of us. So the role of private land conservation. I like to think of private land conservation as protecting the hard to protect stuff. This is private land, which has very high levels of biodiversity, ecological importance, stress and need for conservation, but it happens in places where there's a lot of stuff going on. It's a very complex land use matrix. It's not like a protected area where there's a single land manager, a single perspective. We're talking about a whole bunch of things that are happening, including economic activity. When we're talking about lands that are in between our core areas, our protected areas, that connective tissue, and we're talking about conserving areas that are challenging because they are working lands. They're active forestry operations, active agricultural operations, and not all of those obviously are appropriate for conservation. Some are. How do we do that? And then also addressing what a colleague of mine calls the ecological middle class. And I really like that term because we spend so much time focused on the best and the top and the last breeding pair of, and we sometimes forget that it's an entire set of systems that we're trying to maintain. And there's a lot of pieces to those systems that have to be maintained that aren't necessarily in the top 10% of the class. Okay, so to give you a picture of private land conservation in Alberta, what I did was put together some data of the number of acres of privately conserved land and the number of acres of provincially conserved land. So that means provincial parks, natural areas, ecological reserves, wilderness areas, all of that. If you take all of that as 100%, that's all of the protected acres. And you look at that by watershed. This is what it looks like, and it's important to kind of zero in down here at the bottom. So this is the North Saskatchewan watershed, the Red Deer, the South Saskatchewan. Of all of the protected acres in the South Saskatchewan, 37% of those are privately conserved acres. In the Red Deer, it's even more, 46.7%. Then we get to North Saskatchewan, 9.4, basically the white area, the settled area, has a huge amount of the protected acres being privately conserved. But what's important is to take a look at that map and then take a look, I just gathered, hopefully this works, I just gathered some of the images that Multistar has put together of the ranges of endangered species in Alberta. And how many of those endangered species exist in these areas that private land conservation is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in trying to conserve those habitats, conserve those species. So now I'm going to do a similar thing, private land conservation as a percentage of total provincial and private protected areas, but I'm going to do it by rural municipality. And I think this is an even more interesting picture. So everywhere you see the dark green in that map, it means that 80 to 100% of the protected acres in that rural municipality are privately conserved lands. And in 7 of them, it's 100%. All of the protected area in those municipalities is privately conserved. Now, the reality is, we have very little conservation going on in these areas. That's why those numbers are so high. It's not that there's a huge number of acres, but like I said, this is what private land conservation does. It helps protect in the areas that are very difficult to protect. And you see, of course, that it matches the white area, it matches where we have our private lands. Okay, one of the things about private land conservation that's really important is the ability to put controls on use. And the conservation easement in this picture, actually, it extends, aside from that mountain range at the top, the conservation easement extends over that entire area. So perpetually protected from any sort of subdivision and sort of development. I put this picture up because it was interesting when the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database was being put together. This area had to struggle like crazy to be included in that database, and that area was put in instantly. No questions, no assessment. So we sometimes have a bit of a misconception about what protection actually looks like, what conservation actually looks like. And private land conservation can play a big part in sort of achieving what we expect to have from protection. So I'm going to talk about conservation easements, and just first of all, who here has heard of conservation easements? Just by a show of hands. Okay, of those people who put their hands up, who feels like they could turn to the person next to them and capably describe what a conservation easement is? That's usually how it goes, right? We've heard about this tool, we know it's out there. Most municipalities have written into their municipal development plan, we should consider conservation easements. It's a thing, it's good, but not a lot of understanding about what conservation easements are. I'm going to go through these 5 things, just sort of the basics, then what those agreements actually look like, what happens after the agreement, the financial components, because that's actually becoming a big challenge for a lot of this mystery of why people are finding it scary. And then the municipal part of it, because one of the things I'm going to mention is the rural municipalities of Alberta, where we have a number of municipalities that have been very, very supportive of private land conservation, have now twice had resolutions at their convention to curtail the use of conservation easements. The first one to limit up to 40 years. And then just last week, one to require that municipalities get consultation or essentially a veto on the placement of conservation easement. So the ABCs, it's a private contract. It's a contract between a landowner and we'll call a qualified organization. We'll describe that in a second. And in that, the landowner voluntarily gives up certain rights and opportunities. In the US, they just say rights. We don't have the same perspective of rights in Canada, but we do have the ability to pursue those rights. So often it's the case of opportunities that we're looking at. Granted to a qualified organization and done in favor of conservation. It is for the identified conservation values of that property. That's what the agreement is written around. And they all follow a basic format that's very similar, but every single one is different. The conservation easement, as it's sort of considered across the continent, they've been around for over 100 years, is an item that gets registered on title and it runs with the land in perpetuity, regardless of the owner. Whoever the next owner is, those restrictions that are in the conservation easement apply in the future. An appraiser, a qualified appraiser, calculates the dollar value of the conservation easement, and then that landowner who grants the easement is compensated 100% for the value of that easement. But then the landowner continues to live on, to work the land, they can sell, will, gift the land. It just has to happen within those restrictions and those prescriptions that are listed in the conservation easement. So I grew up watching cartoons, so I describe everything in cartoons. If you think of a piece of land as a bundle of opportunities and rights, there are things that this landowner can do. They can harvest trees, graze, cultivate, irrigate, build, subdivide. In the case of a conservation easement, when you find a qualified organization that you're going to work with, some of those things are transferred to that qualified organization. In Alberta, it's largely land trust, but there are a few municipalities who do this as well. And then with that agreement, they identify certain rights and opportunities, and those are transferred to the qualified organization. Now, that doesn't mean that that qualified organization now has the ability to build or has the ability to subdivide. It just means that the easement that's placed on the property restricts and essentially removes those abilities in perpetuity. So a conservation easement is enabled under the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. It's actually older than the Land Stewardship Act, it goes back to 1995, but it was ported into that new act. And it has to be for one of these three purposes: protection, conservation, enhancement of the environment, natural, scenic, and aesthetic values, or agricultural land for agricultural purposes. Those first two purposes have always been there. The third one, the agricultural land, was added in 2009. And we're one of only two provinces that have the ability to do conservation easements purely for agricultural land. The vast majority, essentially all of them except for one or two, are for the environment. I believe that there is one for natural, scenic, and aesthetic values. I'm still hunting that one down. There's a new organization, the Alberta Farmland Trust, that focuses on just that purpose. But again, the vast majority of them are for the environment. But 90% of those easements are on parcels that have active agricultural operations. Conservation and ag is happening at the same time. Obviously, it has to be agriculture that fits within the restrictions of that conservation easement. But even though these are listed out very separately, you actually can have them combined. The qualified organization, the legislation lists them as being a local or provincial government, so an agency, different types of local governments, municipalities, special areas board, that sort of thing, or a land trust. And a land trust is a not-for-profit registered charity, and it has to have one of its goals be holding land or holding interest in land for the purposes of conservation. And so in Alberta, we have a variety of land trusts, some that you will have heard of, very likely, some that you may not have heard of. 6 of them are regional, meaning they focus on a particular region. 3 focus on the entire province, and 2 are national land trusts that are active in Alberta. So we have a variety of these organizations, and again, they've been working in Alberta for the last 30 years. In that 30 years, we've got about 500,000 acres of privately conserved land. That means land that has been purchased in fee simple, meaning it was just purchased by a land trust, and also land that's under a conservation easement. Government of Alberta holds a couple, 13 municipalities hold a bunch of them. And there are some non-land trust conservation organizations like the Calgary Zoo. They actually own conservation land. They are an NGO that does, but they're not what we would call a land trust, even though they are doing that work. I'm just going to mention this to point out that there is quite an in-depth process for it. Negotiation of the agreement, even prior to that, the land trust is figuring out, is this even worth conserving? Is this a good parcel? Then there's a baseline documentation report, lays out everything ecological and everything anthropogenic. What is happening on this property? There's a financial appraisal because the compensation provided to the landowner is based on the financial value. There's legal reviews, talking to your family or your corporate partners, accounting reviews, estate planning. That actually comes up to be a very important part for a lot of especially agricultural families. Then you have to apply for funding and ultimately register the easement on title. And there's a couple of notifications that you have to provide. So it's a pretty complex process. Question that gets asked a lot, are they all the same? No, each agreement is unique to that organization. They all start with their own template and they negotiate based on that template, but also to that landowner and to that parcel of land. Each one is different. And that's one of the challenges, because if you've seen, say your neighbor has a conservation easement, you don't know what was unique to that one and what's in all of them. So it's sometimes really hard to tell what is a conservation easement. How does it affect the parcel? The main thing is that it restricts land use and provides also restrictions and prescriptions. Restrictions meaning stuff you can't do, and prescriptions meaning things that you must do. Previous tools didn't provide that ability. These are some of the common restrictions that you'll see. The ones that have started at the top, subdivision and building, those are pretty much in every conservation easement. But there can be limits on timber harvest, timber removal, mining and excavations, drainage of water, fencing, water pollution. I always laugh because some of the ones that are put in are actually things that are illegal and you're not supposed to do anyways, but we recognize they often get done, so we put them into the conservation easements as well. Generally perpetual, that's what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit further on. The access question is a big one. Is the public allowed on? There's nothing in there that says that access has to happen or can't happen. It's really silent. What access there is for the easement holder. They can come onto the property, assess whether there's been an infraction, do the monitoring, that sort of thing. But for public access, again, that's something that's negotiated. And there's no restriction in the future disposition, so selling it, giving it to your kids, any sort of disposition of the property. The landowner retains all rights that are spoken to in the agreement. Basically, if the agreement doesn't say something about it, the landowner holds that. And as I mentioned, the public access is something that they negotiate. It's not required. For the most part, people just retain the public access that they retained prior to that. Hunting access with permission, that sort of thing. But it doesn't speak to it within the conservation legislation or the agreements. Can conservation easements be temporary? Yes, they can. Our legislation was written and says whatever term. But as you'll note from the gray hair, I was there back in the mid-90s when this was being created in legislation, and there was no contemplation that this was going to ever be something people would do temporarily. They were intended to be perpetual agreements. One of the reasons that land trusts, those organizations that work doing conservation, avoid temporary easements is because it just doesn't work for their business model. They're not eligible for charitable tax receipts. That increases costs. The acquisition costs for a temporary easement and for a permanent easement are the same, so you get limited conservation for the same cost. The conservation outcomes are temporary. Try and go to a funder and raise money to protect a property that you protected already and now is no longer protected. And probably the biggest thing is that right now they can't satisfy the demand for perpetual easements. So there really isn't any sort of business case for them to go for temporary easements. Okay, after the conservation easement, easements are monitored and maintained. The CE holder monitors that easement on a regular basis, regular visits, new technology is being used all the time, drones and imagery interpretation. The CE holder usually creates a stewardship fund, money that's put in right at the very beginning that they can draw on in small amounts because these agreements are perpetual, so that they can fund the work of the organization over time. How are they enforced? Well, it's a private contract. It's enforced like any other contract. So there'll be the remedies that are available to the parties listed right in the agreement. And that goes from bargaining in good faith all the way up to remedies within the courts. The reality for enforcement is that enforcement is communication. The more your communication goes up, the more your enforcement goes down, because most infractions are just people didn't know, especially a second landowner or a third landowner. So the more you can talk to them, the more you can make them aware, the less likely there's going to be an infraction. And even when there is, for the most part, they're easily remedied. Can they be changed? Yes. Can they be terminated? Yes. So a landowner and a CE holder can, on a mutual agreement, come together and say, we're going to change this agreement. Now, that's within constraints. They can't agree to say, oh, now we're going to build a 10-story building on this property. It still has to be within the conservation value constraints that are written into the agreement. This one terrifies a lot of people. The minister can modify or terminate a conservation easement if it is in the public interest to do so, which is exactly the powers they have of expropriation anyway. So this really doesn't create anything new for them. And in the last 30 years, it's never happened. It's never been used. So it's something that makes ministers feel comfortable in the legislation, but to actually step in and take a private contract for conservation between a landowner and a land trust and then terminate is going to be a very challenging situation, let's say. Okay, how are landowners compensated? This is something that people don't understand because so many of the programs for helping landowners, incentive programs and that sort of thing are not based on the actual amount that is being given up, they're a payment. So first and foremost, they're compensated by helping to achieve their personal conservation goals. That's one of the things that's happened in the last 5 years. We're forgetting that. This is not about making money, finding new revenue streams, generating new opportunities. It's to try and help that landowner with their conservation goals. And then to offset the financial hit that they might take in doing that, they can be compensated for the grant of that easement. And it's with a tax receipt for the full value or for a portion of that, cash payment for a portion of that, usually what we call a split receipt, which is some portion of the value is a tax receipt, some portion of the value is in cash. I listed this one too because with municipalities, sometimes the developer can secure development approval by granting a conservation easement, but that comes in a very different kind of context. But that's another way that they can be compensated. The best way to think about this is imagine that this is the financial value of land. That bar represents the whole thing. It's the fair market value. What we do with appraising conservation easements to figure out the value of the easement is we do qualified appraiser, just like a land appraisal. What is the fair market value of the land? Then they do it again, this time with the conservation easement on the property. We call it the before and after process. So before it was equal to that, after it's only equal to that amount. The value, the financial value of the conservation easement is the difference there. And that is not a standard thing. I always get asked, so what do these things generally go for? In fact, I'm not answering that. I'm gonna duck under the table if anyone asks me that. Because it's like saying, what does a house cost? And then where you are and where the market is, and is somebody a motivated buyer or not? It's very much a market transaction. One of the things though to understand is that if you have high development pressure, everybody wants that parcel to subdivide it, to build it, that sort of thing. Then that means when you remove that subdivision and building potential, you've lost a lot of the value. So in a high development pressure area, the value of the easement is really large. In a low development pressure area, the value of the easement is, the value financially is quite small because it depends on what that appraisal says in that area. Do landowners receive ongoing payments for CEs? No. Conservation easements are a one-time transfer of an interest in land, and there's a one-time compensation for 100%. Are conservation easements mandatory? No, they're entirely voluntary. Again, it's a private contract between a qualified organization and a willing landowner to come together and figure out whether or not they want to do this. Again, it can be used to secure a development approval depending on the municipality. And sometimes the municipality might say, in order to get the approval, you have to place a conservation easement. It's still voluntary because development is actually voluntary. You don't have to do it. Does conservation easement need to be approved by the government? No, again, it's a private contract. It's already enabled as a contractual mechanism, but you have to register it on land titles for it to take effect. And there are notifications. You have to notify the municipality. You have to notify these two ministers. The minister, the representative in transportation doesn't understand this. And every time he gets an easement, he thinks that he's approving it. And everybody has to keep telling him, for the last 15 years, no, you're not approving it, you're just receiving it for notification. But that's okay, I'm over it. Okay. Does a conservation easement trump municipal planning? No, it doesn't. And again, there's a lot of concern about this, but it doesn't change or supersede local zoning, bylaws, development permits. A conservation easement can restrict further, but it can't permit anything that local regulations don't permit. So in this example, let's say a conservation easement states, identify 2 building envelopes in perpetuity. Those are the only 2 places that you can build. But the municipal zoning says you can only have 1 parcel in, or 1 parcel out of that entire area. Well, the result is the municipal zoning takes precedence. If it says you can only have 1 house, then you can only have 1 house. And you still have to follow the building regulations and the building development permitting. It just means that the easement has restricted to a certain point. If the municipality restricts beyond that, their laws trump. Are conservation easements subject to property taxes? Yes. A property with an easement is assessed in the same way every other property is. You pay taxes based on that assessment. Some municipalities choose to waive or to discount property taxes, but that's entirely up to them. That's their choice, and they enact that in their bylaws around taxation. Okay, this is where it starts to get weird. Growing misconceptions about conservation easements. So in terms of demand, there's this myth that landowners don't want to do perpetual conservation easements. And I'm going to dig into that in a fair amount in just a second. But right now, Alberta land trusts all report that they have more demand for perpetual conservation easements, ones that have no end stated in the agreement, than they can satisfy. Now, does that mean that all landowners want to grant conservation easements? Definitely not. And that's good, because all parcels are not, they're not of a quality that would be appropriate for a conservation easement. It's only good quality, ecologically valuable land. So there is limitations in terms of capacity more than there is limitations in terms of demand. Perpetual easements bind the hands of future landowners. I have to put this one in because it's thrown at me repeatedly and title it fact, not myth. Because yeah, that's what conservation is aiming to do, is to perpetually make sure that is conserved. And it's funny because there's lots of ways that a landowner, using their private property rights, can do things that will bind the hands of future landowners. Subdivide a ranch or a farm and develop houses all across it. Guess what? You have bound the hands of the future landowner. Granting a perpetual conservation easement does the same thing, but for some reason, we get uptight when it's conservation in perpetuity, but not when it's development in perpetuity. So you look at a parcel like this, and I have to ask, when you look at this and you say, okay, the private landowner has bound the hands of future landowners, is that down here, or is that actually up here? That strikes me that there's a lot more things that could happen here than could happen here. So we get this very odd perspective of what we can and can't do, or what we should and shouldn't do to bind future landowners. A lot of these things I'm putting footnotes here, and I'm being very gentle. I'm not actually tagging the person's name or the political office that they may hold currently or anything, just saying it's a common political rumor. Payments for conservation easements is just money to pay off wealthy ranchers. So unlike other agro-environmental programs, payments for conservation easements can't be misconstrued as a subsidy in any way, shape, or form, because you're being compensated for what you are giving up, what you are selling, what you're disposing of. So paying off wealthy ranchers, no, it is purchasing from them and paying for it. Myth, private land conservation drives up the price of land. We hear this one all the time, and increasingly over the last 5 years, and especially within the ag industry. So just as an example of both the 2023 farm credits, farmland values report, and looked at what they attribute land price increases to. Large producers expanding, number one. Specialty crops recording high yields and resulting in increased demand, rising land price. And number three, rising irrigation land values. Basically, everything that is not conserving is driving the prices up. Conservation is not driving land prices up. Myth, this one in the rural municipalities of Alberta resolution, it said this. They have tax and financial benefits that unduly influence the land market. No, they don't. Again, the market analyses show absolutely no effect from private land conservation. And the compensation for the conservation easement is the value of it by a qualified appraiser. There's no mysterious backroom calculations or secret deals that are influencing land markets. Large amounts of land are privately conserved. Put this in municipal rumor as well. It's everywhere. Okay, so far, easements and fee simple, we've got about 500,000 acres. The whole white area is about 69 million acres. That means 0.73 of 1% of private land base is currently conserved in private land conservation. If that was actually having an impact on land values, that would be amazing how something that is 0.73% could actually have that kind of an impact. This one's new. Conservation is, as we all know, there's been a lot of talk about some renewable infrastructure in political and media circles lately. This one has come straight to the sector. Both political and industry rumor. Conservation easements facilitate solar farms and other renewable infrastructure. Conservation easements protect the nature, the properties and nature conservation values. So renewable infrastructure, and by this I'm talking about at scale, I'm talking about industrial renewable infrastructure, that's at odds with nature conservation. There isn't a single land trust that would be signing any agreement that promotes that. I mean, individual solar panels on a barn or small amounts of wind generation, obviously that's not an issue. But what's most likely to happen is a conservation easement prevents applications for major industrial infrastructure of any type. Another myth, conservation easements affect access to adjacent properties. Again, this was written directly into these resolutions that go to RMA. They have the whereas clauses, then the background, and then the resolution, the member background. And the whereas clauses, we last one took a 40-page report to try and deal with all of the factual inaccuracies that are listed as whereas clauses. And those poor counselors are sitting there with their voting button going, I said to a colleague of mine, if that actually was what a conservation easement was, I would vote against it too. That thing sounds horrible, but that's not actually what they do. So now it's going to affect access to adjacent properties. No, there's nothing in a conservation easement that affects an adjacent property. It's all about that individual property. And their existing agreements, road allowances, none of those things are affected in the sense that if the landowner doesn't have ownership of those rights, doesn't have control of those rights, they can't sign an agreement to grant that away. I can't sign an agreement with you to sell my neighbor's car. I don't own my neighbor's car. So conservation easements can't give away these things that are being suggested or concerns. Oh, they're going to be building over the road allowances and not allow us to, are conserving over the road allowances and not allow us to build. Not true, we can't do that. And that was the next thing in the resolution, the one last week. They were concerned that they wouldn't be able to build any roads now because of conservation easement. It was a little bit of a shrill resolution, but the bottom line is if your municipality wants to build a road on a private property, they have to get an agreement with that private landowner or they have to expropriate the property. Easement has absolutely no impact on that whatsoever. Again, the landowner doesn't have the ability to control that. Now we get into the federal government stuff, and this is where it gets way more tinfoil hat. Okay, conservation easements around national parks enable these lands to be rolled into national parks. No, it's private land. Yes, a government can expropriate land. Yes, they have the ability to do that, but that doesn't have anything to do with this. And expropriating land for a national park is a pretty high bar. We have done it in the past, in the early 1900s and late 1800s, but not now. Conservation easements, regardless, would have absolutely no impact on that. Federal support for private land conservation, the funding that comes from the federal government, is due to the Government of Canada's emissions reduction plan. This one we hear on a weekly basis. It's they can attribute it to Gilbo, but now they'll just attribute it to the current government. But the federal funding started in 2018 as the Natural Heritage Conservation Program. The emissions reduction plan was released in 2022. No, there's no connection between those things. Conservation easements take land out of agriculture. Again, over 90% of our conservation easements are actually on agricultural operations. And if the existing land management regime led to it being worth conserving, you want to maintain that land management regime. And if it didn't lead to it being worth conserving, the land trusts aren't there, nobody's putting an easement on it. There's actually a lot of effort put into making sure that the agreements will allow for that ongoing management in a sustainable way. Addition of outbuildings to a certain degree, continuation of the ag practices, that sort of thing. This is perhaps the most cartoonish and fun one. Conservation easements make it hard for young ag producers to buy land. I can't count the number of times I've heard this. There was this young couple and they were refused financing because the property they were talking about had a conservation easement on it. Everybody was telling us about this. So the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, Corvus Centre, Southern Alberta Land Trust, we all went looking for the young couple. No one can find that couple. So that, okay, well, let's go find the bank. There's not that many banks that people would be going to in Southern Alberta till then. No one could find the bank. So this rumor was circulating. What was really frustrating about it was it's actually the exact opposite. Because the grant of a conservation easement removes all of that speculative value, basically the value for developing it and for subdividing it. And once you remove that, it takes it back down to ag value, which means young agriculture producers actually can afford that. So Young Farmers for Climate in Canada, Young Farmers Coalition in the United States, they all support conservation easements because this is exactly the opposite and exactly not true. Okay. But now that we have all of those problems and we've accepted that all of those problems, we now have a solution. It's temporary conservation easements. And if you're having trouble making the connection between all of those things that I said were the problem and this being the solution, join the club. We're all trying to figure out exactly why this is the solution. So a temporary conservation easement is a 25 to 40-year term. It'll end in that period of time. And it's presented as this solution to our private land conservation problem. But my suggestion is it's a short-term solution and it's for problems we don't actually have. So in terms of conservation, the outcomes are by definition temporary. And I always think of it as like the world's worst environmental protest, where clean air for at least a while, clean water for one generation but no longer, wildlife habitat until, well, we want to do something else. Like, that is not a conservation motivation. So not really a conservation solution. It's a short-term solution. Increased closing costs. I mentioned this before. The cost to secure something in perpetuity or temporarily is the same, but you have to pay for that all again. It's difficult to fundraise for that. The speculation at that point, oh, the cost of that property 40 years from now when it comes onto the market will be insane. So it's not a financial solution. It's when you think of it as a cost benefit analysis, think of two retirement funds. You invest for 40 years in one, and the other one you invest for 40 years and you have absolutely nothing at the end of it. So it's not really a good investment for land trust resources. And then the other things, the problems that it's supposed to address are really not problems that we have. So these are the main criticisms of perpetual conservation easement. Ties the hands of future landowners, negative economic impacts, and loss of local government planning authority. I could do a whole evening on each one of those, but just leave it at temporary conservation easements would still have these problems for 1 to 2 generations. So it's not really, it's a bit of a bait and switch. It's not really solving any of these problems you say that they're going to be solving. Also say that there's no demand for perpetual conservation easements. So we did some work in the United States and we worked with land trusts. We surveyed all of the land trusts in these 8 states. And we found that 56% of them said demand for conservation easement was either increasing or increasing dramatically. Conservation easements that were perpetual. 69% said that demand exceeded their available funding, meaning the challenge was finding funding, not finding people who were interested in perpetual conservation. And when we looked at the National Conservation Easement Database in the United States, between 2010 and 2020, in those states, they averaged a 61% increase in acres under perpetual conservation. I'm pretty sure there's demand for this. We're actually going to be repeating that same methodology in Alberta so that we have numbers for this to go side by side. Landowners want short-term regular payment options. Yes, they do. And there are a ton of short-term regular payment option programs. So you're not actually providing something that doesn't already exist. So why do we have this push for temporary conservation easements? We were trying to figure this out. We did a lot of work and a lot of surveying, a lot of head scratching, and we sort of came down to 2 key factors. One, who we're actually talking to, and 2, the expectations of agro-environmental programming. So who we're actually talking to. From an agricultural producer perspective, you could say that some of them are conservation motivated, some of them are transaction motivated. It's the business aspect, it's the deal part of it, it's the business improvement aspect. And the reality is every single agriculture producer is some mix of those things and about 100 other things as well. But it is fair to say that some are more conservation motivated and some are more transaction motivated. Okay, so when we're having conversations with agricultural producers, the more conservation motivated ones are talking to their local land trust, to the conservancy who works in their area. The more transaction motivated ones, they're talking to the producer association. That's the group that can help them find new markets, increase revenue streams, increase value added products. That's the agribusiness side. That makes sense. So when we're researching agricultural producer motivations for conservation, we know that there's a bunch of the more conservation motivated landowners, and there's a ton of the more transaction motivated landowners. But as researchers, our number one imperative is as many landowners as possible. We want that end to be as high as possible. So what happens when we do our conversations? We're talking to the producer associations and they're telling us, oh, demand is low, because everybody, it's like when you walk into the McDonald's and ask them who makes the best coffee, they're probably going to say McDonald's. And when you walk into A&W and say who makes the best coffee, they're probably going to say A&W. Those conversations are not happening with those folks, but we're not talking to land trusts and conservancies, but they are telling everybody, no, actually demand is high, we can't keep up with the demand. Okay, the second factor is the expectations that we have around agro-environmental programming. This is just kind of historically how it has rolled out. And especially when we look south of the border. Payment for practices programs, the farm bill down there is a huge driver of this kind of expectation, generation of new revenue streams. In other words, regular payments, not one-time payment, regular payments. So that's sort of the history and the mentality. So I mentioned these criticisms of conservation easements. Well, number 4 is conservation easements only pay, the programs only pay once. And I think this is a big challenge for us in communication because we're not describing it properly. If you think of land as being like a cake, you can cut off a slice. You can have a slice of that, a 40-acre parcel, and you can dispose of that. And what happens is it gets valued by an appraiser, it gets disposed of, sold, and you're compensated for it once. With a conservation easement, it's challenging because it's not a slice, it's a layer. It's an interest in land across the entire land. But when you get rid of it, it's the same thing. It gets valued by a qualified appraiser, disposed of once, and you're compensated for once. We're not describing conservation easements in this way. And so we're getting a lot of misconceptions about what they are when we're talking to landowners from a financial perspective. Okay, so the mystery is solved. Who made perpetual conservation easements scary? Butler did it. Actually, 3 Butlers did it. There were 3 of them. Butler number 1, us, in the mirror, conservation sector. Too quiet about private land conservation, especially with municipalities, let this massive information vacuum, won't share our data with them, and yet get frustrated they won't include it in their land use planning. And we don't tell them the good news stories. We only show up there when the municipality says, hey, we've got a problem, come in and we're going to pull you up on the map and talk to council. We have definitely gotten too financially focused. So instead of talking about the financial aspects of conservation easement being, oh, this is a way to offset the financial impact. We're talking about, oh, this is going to generate new revenue streams and it's going to give you access to carbon markets and it's going to, and in all of that, we're getting, way too customer focused, way too like a business instead of like a conservation charity. If there's demand for temporary conservation easements, we need to explore that. That is a good business strategy. It's a terrible conservation strategy. No. You don't, because it leads to poor conservation outcomes, and you've already got a tool that leads to amazing conservation outcomes. Just because it's being asked for doesn't mean that it should be given. And we've talked to the wrong landowners. We keep surveying transactionally motivated landowners to take the pulse of conservation interest, and we're getting wrong information, and we're doing that to ourselves. But the agribusiness sector also is one of the butlers. They're definitely powering the rumor mill right now. So all of these barriers to agriculture narrative, those are definitely being driven by the agribusiness sector, the producer associations, who used to be one of the strongest supporters of conservation easements back when we first got the legislation. We've also got this weird thing where it's promoting this perspective that conservation must be paid for. It's transactional conservation. It means that all of the people who want to do it for conservation reasons kind of get crowded out because it's being turned into, you want conservation, you gotta pay for it, sorry, show me the money. There is this commitment to maintaining the land base, keeping it from being fragmented, from being converted, but only by temporary agreement. So it means that, you know, I want to maintain my opportunity cost. What if I want to destroy that nature later? I want to be able to do that. Again, that's not conservation. That's, you know, good business strategy. Third butler, the provincial government, they're playing an odd role in this right now. So first of all, they ignored what I call the delivery agents, the people who are actually doing conservation easement transactions, the land trusts. So they started promoting tools that the sector's not using, trying to get them to use these tools. There are other groups out there that are using those tools and using them just fine. They talk to the ag industry instead of the conservation groups. They keep, again, the same thing. Let's go and talk to all of the producer groups. I call it focus on buying rural votes. So they've just created a new private land conservation framework. And one of the goals of the private land conservation framework is, quote, provide landowners with new funding opportunities. That is not a goal, that's a tactic. And a good tactic to consider, you know, what are the financial motivations and incentives, but that is not a goal. You are not supposed to be setting out to do that. And it reflects one of the challenges that's happening internally with the provincial government is they're over blending agriculture goals and environmental goals, because this new funding opportunities is a good part of agriculture and irrigation's business plan, but it's not a good part of environment and protected areas plan. And then, oddly, they put themselves in charge. So by creating the private land conservation framework and then asking for feedback on it, and asking all of the land trusts to provide input, but then not tell them kind of how that's going to be used or why, or that sort of thing. We got this weird situation where private land conserved by non-government organizations is supposed to be led by a government strategy. You can't have a less government initiative than private land conserved by non-government organizations. And they're starting to take programs that they like and start to dictate them to the land trusts and say, oh, payment for ecosystem services, we love that. We don't know what we're going to do about it. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we need you guys to start doing that. And so land trusts are trying to figure out, I guess we got to start doing these programs. No, you don't. You need to stick with your mandate. The last thing I'll say is that we've got this kind of financially rudderless situation with all of this programming. The Land Stewardship Fund, which funds the Alberta Land Trust Grant Program, has been granting about $5 million a year, sometimes up to $10 million. When we're talking about purchasing interest in land, it's a tiny, tiny little bit of money. There's very little money left in that fund. And that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because that fund is funded by the sale of public lands. So the good news story here for me is that the sale of public lands is going down. That fund is not increasing. But their solution to the fund losing any money is to create new programs and a payment for ecosystem services, temporary conservation easements. But there are no strategies to fund conservation. Every time we talk about it and ask them for it, they say, well, no, we haven't, you know, we're going to figure out all of the rest of it first, and then we'll figure out how to pay for it. Now, the interesting thing is, there's a lot of really good examples, and we wrote a report for them. It's available on our website, how to make the land stewardship fund sustainable. Don't do it from selling public lands. Look around us, Quebec, Montana, Colorado, all of these jurisdictions have really good programs. So for example, Montana takes 20% of their cannabis revenues and they devote that to private land conservation. They fund private land conservation through that. If Alberta took 1% of our cannabis revenues and put it to private land conservation, we would quadruple the amount of money that we're currently investing in it. There are lots of very sustainable strategy options. Like I said, we wrote a whole report of them, but there's not a lot of effort being put into trying to figure that out. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this. My sort of 7 takeaways here. Is that 7? Yeah, it's 7. Municipalities need to hear from land trusts a lot more, not just when there's an issue, not just when there's a crisis. Go in, talk to them. You need to move away from the government of Alberta dependency. I remember in 2011, when they created the Land Trust Grant Program, a colleague of mine, and I, we were talking and saying, this is gonna change private land conservation. Everyone's gonna get really dependent on that. And when it inevitably ends, it's gonna be a real struggle. But now that there's all of these machinations of, well, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. It's not really a grant program, it's these hidden services contracts where they just want the land trust to do their work. They need to move away from that. They also need to share their information, share their data. Let the municipalities know where those properties are. Right now, everybody's, oh, if a landowner knew that, you know, that information was out there, it's actually already out there. It's in land titles. It's just not easily accessible, but it's all public information. If you actually gave it to them, they might actually be doing their planning around some of your properties. Share the story, share the good news part of it. We need to develop a sustainable provincial funding mechanism for private land conservation, and it's, to me, low-hanging fruit. I think it's really easy to do. This is on my to-do list, creating Alberta-specific data for demand, for perpetual conservation easements, and capacity for perpetual conservation easements. So that instead of going with rumors, we actually have numbers. Focus way more on ag producers and way less on producer associations. Those are the people who you actually do deals with. Those are the people who you should be talking to. And last, and definitely not least, actively shift away from transaction-centered conservation to conservation-centered transactions. In the first one, transaction-centered conservation means that you only get conservation if there's a transaction. This needs to be changed to conservation-centered transactions where we say, no, you only get a transaction if there's conservation. If we start from that perspective, we will get rid of a lot of the myths, a lot of the rumors, a lot of the barriers, and become much more mission focused. And that's all I have to say. That's my contact information. If anybody wants to get the presentation or call me, it's not a like 555-1800 number that no one answers. It actually is my phone number. So if you do want to reach out, I would be happy to chat.
Wonderful. Everything I didn't know about land conservation easements. So thank you very much. I think it's one of those things that unless you have land and you're considering it, I don't think a lot of people have a lot of background knowledge on. So we're very grateful for you to come and share that with us. I know it broadens our perspective and we're happy to help communicate that. So maybe we'll talk about other opportunities to share that message out. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people that are interested. Amy, were there any questions online or?
Yeah, there is one, I think.
Do we anticipate that conservation easement will be reported to the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database in 2025?
2024, 25. Yes and no. They changed the reporting into the Canadian Protected and Conserved Areas database, affectionately known as CPCAD, to allow entities that have data to upload that data directly. Prior to that, it used to be you always had to go through your jurisdiction, i.e. your provincial government, who may or may not like private land conservation, may or may not like conservation easement. So it was always very challenging. The problem is the database is still functionally inappropriate for privately conserved land. All of the assessment of whether it can go in there is kind of based on how much do you look like a provincial park? And that's a really easy answer. You don't, because it's not a park. It's privately conserved land and it uses very different tools with very different kinds of legal mechanisms and protections. So there's a continuing conversation with the Alliance of Canadian Land Trusts and the federal government to try and change that. But the short answer is yes, you can upload that data directly if you are the owner of that data. But we're still working to get the holders of the database to understand what that means when it goes in, and then coordinate all of the land trusts across Canada to be entering the data in the same way.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Hi, would it create any hurdles for like restoration activities or anything else in that, on that end of conservation that's been more active?
Yeah, good question. Again, I feel like I'm gonna answer every question, yes and no. No, it shouldn't. The way that conservation easements are traditionally considered, improving the conservation values is just fine. The regular reports will account for that. The agreement can be modified to, let's say you restored a wetland on a property that had a restorable basin, but it wasn't a fully functioning wetland. You can adjust the agreement then to say, and now there will be these restrictions around the wetland. And same thing with the activities that might have an impact while you're doing the restoration, you can account for those. So that's my no, it's not a problem. Here's my yes, it is a problem. I didn't dive into this, but there is something called the Ecological Gifts Program, where when you make a donation to a land trust of either a conservation easement or a piece of land, you can also have that certified as a gift of ecologically significant property. When you make a donation, you get a tax receipt for it no matter what, or you get payment for it no matter what. But if you get this certification, there are some additional tax benefits that you can get. The most important one is it removes essentially the capital gains you may have accrued on the property. And that's a hugely attractive thing for a lot of people. The problem is, once you do that, you now come under the federal government's Environment and Climate Change Canada's, it's actually in the Income Tax Act, change in use clause, which says you're not allowed to change anything without the permission of the federal government. Which could be okay, you would think in a restoration context, that would be fine. But we've had numerous examples where basically it was, no, sorry, that's a change. We had one example in southern Alberta. Landowner wanted to move a house from an area that was actually more ecologically sensitive into an area that was less ecologically sensitive. Holder of the easement said, yeah, that sounds great. They were shown the plan. They presented that to the Eco Gifts program. They said, no, that's a change. So, well, what if, we get independent third-party verification from qualified biologists to tell you just exactly what the net improvement is? No, that's not gonna. What if we post a bond so that it can be restored no matter what? And even if we sell the land or disappear, no, you can't. That's gonna be a change. It's being interpreted inconsistently. Ontario wrote their own rules. Alberta still goes under the national rules. So if you don't get approval for a change in use, they impose a tax on the land trust equal to 50% of the value of the gift, the land gift. So it's a hugely punitive cost if there's a change in use, and none of that goes on the landowner, it just goes on to the land trust. So my answer to your question is, if it's not an eco gift, no problem.
Yeah, I was just wondering, have any of these 20-year contracts been actually completed? And the second part is, what about putting a clause in these temporary contracts that do automatic renewals for conservation purposes?
Yeah, so this is one of the challenging things is temporary agreements. We have lots of them, we have lots of practice with them. Ducks Unlimited has done a bunch of them. Manitoba Habitat Conservancy. There's a lot of these temporary agreements that say you will manage the land this way and you get a payment either on an annual basis or some of them are what they call results-based agreements, where if you have a certain amount of productivity from that den or from a certain amount of activity on that lek or that sort of thing. So we have all of those kinds of agreements that we can use. Most of them aren't, some are, but most of them are not 25 to 45 kind of year agreements. A lot of those are written with yeah, you could renew this if you want, especially a commitment that there will be funding for that. The problem is that you don't have to renew them. So all of the effort into the conservation means that at the end of that, if there isn't a requirement to renew it, then first of all, it's no longer conserved and lots of things can happen. Secondly, to your question about restoration, the land trust will not invest that resources in helping that landowner find different kinds of support for different kinds of stewardship activity. Your first question, do some of these exist? They don't yet under this name. The Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association created a foundation with one of the goals to do these temporary agreements, and they're working with a number of folks, including the federal government, to look at how they could be applied for critical habitat for species at risk. And that is one of the cases where I think it could be viable if thought through properly. It's a triage situation, right? It's like, how do we get the habitat conserved right now? We can't wait for another 4 years to negotiate an agreement and that sort of thing. But the question is, we often talk about these things being gateway things and entry points to, well, you know, eventually maybe they would do something more permanent, but we don't put any strategic thought into how to do that. So it's going to be an interesting question to see how we get to get through those examples that are currently being tried right now, where they lead us.
How might, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase my question. So, and it might vary from situation to situation, but thinking about things like the rights to carbon credits or accessing some of these like additional potential income streams that may or may not develop as time goes on for producers. Who owns those rights when you do it? Is it the easement or like the organization, or is it?
Yeah, good question. So what it boils down to is whatever the agreement says. So like I was saying, anything that isn't spoken to in the agreement automatically is the landowners. So if there's no reference whatsoever to carbon rights in that agreement, then there's nothing that the easement holder can do around that. What tends to happen now is a statement of sharing, so that if there is any carbon revenue from this property, it will be shared usually on a proportion. If the value of the easement was 20% of the value of the entire property, then they'll say 20% of the revenues from carbon credits will go to the easement holder, 80% will go to the landowner. But it's definitely emerging, trying to figure out exactly how to do that. There have been some agreements where it was just because the carbon market is going to be just so filled with pennies and everybody thinks it's going to be filled with $100 bills. There's a lot of starry-eyed kinds of assessments, and there's a lot of agreements that will say, okay, we'll give you, that's mine. I don't know if someone else is, oh goodness, I have to buy beer for everybody now. There are a lot of agreements that will just do a straight transfer and just say, in the payment for this conservation easement, one of the rights that you're giving up is any future revenues for carbon. We will take that and we will increase the payment to you by, X. So very, very wobbly right now, yeah. But I think that sharing route is probably the way they're going to end up going.
Yeah, we've been blessed with, we own 240 acres of wilderness land just southwest of Water Valley in the foothills, and it's got deer, moose, the odd cougar, bear, the odd grizzly bear wanders through there, and so for us this is good timing to get your presentation here, and because we're seriously looking into this whole issue. Two questions. One, who funds you? Who funds your organization? And then how would you deal with like organizations like the Nature Conservation Society or what's it called?
Nature Conservancy.
Yeah. Like how do you overlap or how does it work?
So who funds my organization and who funds land trusts?
Well, I see, okay.
Because we're not a land trust, so we don't do any of the actual agreements. We help land trusts figure out a lot of this stuff. We help them develop policy so that they can answer questions like, how do you deal with carbon in your agreements? How do you deal with subsurface rights, that sort of thing. So you would reach out to a land trust. Like I said, we've got about 10 or 11 land trusts. If you go to a website that's cealberta.ca, so it's ce-alberta.ca. That was created by the Mestakis Institute and the Environmental Law Center, and it lists all of the land trusts that operate in the province. And you can, they all do very similar things in the sense that they can do a conservation easement. It's really about who matches you the best. So SALT is run by the organization I used to work for. It's run by ranchers. It focuses on ranching property. It focuses on agricultural landowners. If that's not you, that might not be the right organization. Nature Conservancy, very biological focused, doesn't have that agricultural component to their mandate, but a lot of their easements are definitely very supportive of agriculture. Maybe that's the route you want to go. Western Skyland Trust works in your area. They're a mid-sized regional land trust. So it's figuring out which one that you want to work with. In terms of how it's funded, like any environmental charity, they're looking for funding on a project-by-project basis. They make applications to the Land Trust Grant Program to get funding for particular projects. The Federal Natural Heritage Conservation Program, they get funding from that to put towards the projects. And then foundations, again, like any environmental organization in Canada, project by project, trying to get the dollars to support the entire organization. And then when they do that, they budget not just for the acquisition, but for a little bit more, so that money can cover their ongoing monitoring and that sort of thing.
There's a question online from Mark Floyd.
Hi, I'm on the board of directors for the Alberta Conservation. Can you hear me okay?
Just a second, Mark, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Any reason on our end why we wouldn't hear it? Mark, would you mind dropping your question into the chat and we'll read it out loud?
Okay.
Yeah, maybe because that's.
Oh, I think we can hear you now, Mark.
Can you hear me now?
No, sorry, my mistake. I
No.
thought I heard something.
While you're doing that, why don't I see if there's another question in the room, and then we can switch back.
Yeah, I'm curious with the rise of temporary easements, has there been instances or even concerns with landholders either trying to switch to a temporary one or even terminating their easement?
No, there hasn't. Still relatively new. They really haven't emerged on, on the landscape, unintended. But you would not be able to switch an existing perpetual easement into a temporary one. That agreement is already signed with those conditions. I guess potentially, because it is a contract and the two parties could agree to do something different. But there would be no incentive for the land trust to switch over to something temporary. The other thing with the temporary easements that's confounding a lot of the work on that right now is how do you value it? Because you can value a perpetual conservation easement because it's been given up, it's been sold, that this is the value of the land with an easement, this is the value without it in perpetuity. Here's what the value of that is. Trying to figure out what the value of a temporary easement is very challenging, and most of the methodologies that have been come up with so far are very, very arbitrary. They're not market-based at all. And so that question is one of those questions on the to-do list that isn't really stopping anybody from rolling ahead with temporary easements. I'll get that figured out.
It doesn't look like he has a question, it looks like a statement.
But maybe if you have any info on that.
Yeah, sure. So ACA, yes, used to do conservation easements. I know that they're still considering on a case-by-case basis conservation easements. The experience in the Crow's Nest Pass with the bison fencing case, this is one of the times that we've only had 3 instances of a conservation easement being challenged and actually going to court. This was definitely the messiest one. What it boiled down to was like the other 2, a reaffirmation of the validity of the conservation easement tool. And without pointing fingers too strongly, the judge's response in that case was you guys needed to communicate with each other better and bargain in good faith. And things got out of control as egos and personalities got in the way. So it became much less about conservation easements, much less about conservation, like the bison fencing. That was one of the things that initially people thought we'd get some resolution on, was just what kinds of guidelines could be used for fencing. Ultimately, that kind of guideline did emerge not from that case though. I know that ACA has a number of reasons why they're not interested in interest in land versus holding land outright. And again, that's a perfectly legitimate tool. I often get accused of being a salesperson for conservation easements. There are by far more conservation properties where easements will not work than there are conservation properties where easements will work. It's a very specific set of circumstances, the easement holder, the landowner, the land, opportunity, time, and everything. So I wouldn't say that the route that ACA has taken is inappropriate at all, leading to conservation.
I have a question. Do you ever work with organizations that are doing like ecological connectivity projects to kind of identify specific lands that would be effective or like important or impactful to consider?
Yeah, it's a good question. So all, I was gonna say all land trusts, that's not true. Land trusts vary from extremely small, volunteer run, focused on the local property that everybody in the community has always thought was valuable. So they raised money and they bought property or put an easement on it or something like that. Their intent was never to do strategic ecosystem-based conservation. Their intent was to conserve the property. When you get up to a large organization like the Nature Conservancy, they have very complex, very science-based strategies on what they will conserve and where they would be interested in conserving properties, what their priority areas are. And a lot of that is based on connectivity and connectivity assessments, a number of other things as well, but especially connectivity, because I think it's, as I mentioned before, one of the roles that private land conservation can really play an important role. One of the challenges is that connectivity becomes so site specific, like, are you talking regional connectivity, are you talking regional corridors? Are you talking Y-to-Y level kinds of connectivity, versus just permeability, like Mark raised the question of fencing on individual properties and that sort of thing. So there are a number of groups that are working on things like that. The Mistakis Institute works a lot on connectivity and connectivity modeling, whether that's a species-based specific assessment for that species of that cohort, or just things like circuitscape and modeling, just how much flow there is across the landscape and how much barrier there is. All of that information, everybody's always looking for all of that kind of information to insert into their strategic planning. Strategic conservation planning, not strategic organizational planning.
Is there a minimum of so many acres per quarter that could be set aside as a conservation easement?
No, there isn't in like a written number. But there is a sort of cost benefit analysis that a land trust will do. So all of the negotiation for a 5-acre property is pretty similar to the negotiation for a 5,000-acre property. You still have to do the initial negotiation, draft the agreement, get the legal review, so when you're looking at those kinds of things, they do have different land trusts will have sort of in their mind, we don't want to do less than a quarter section, we don't want to do less than blah, blah, blah. Now, that changes when you get into one of their priority areas. Or if it's a connective property, if they have an easement here and an easement here, and there's, you know, a strip or a 40-acre piece that is critical in a landscape perspective, then that might change. So that's my very wishy-washy answer. Yes, de facto there is, they don't want to get below a certain level, but there's all sorts of mitigating factors.
Thank you.
First of all, thanks for the presentation. I think I've worked in the sector for about 10 years and this was the best I have ever heard. Pros and cons and all that things. I'm a big believer of having as many tools in the toolbox as we can for conservation. And my question, more pointed at Corvus's work, is how can we drive policy that enables as many of those tools as possible, and hopefully stop some of that like competition for conservation dollars by letting the right tool in the right place for the right person.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think one of the things is, and I know I'm a broken record, I'm on my hobby horse about this. We have to stop operating as businesses and then start operating as charities with a conservation mandate. If I'm a business, you're my competitor and I have to try and get the money before you do. If you're my conservation partner, then we figure out how we do this together. Conservation easements create this amazing opportunity for payment for ecosystem services, payment for stewardship programs. You've got landowners who are committed to conserving their property and want to ramp up their stewardship activity. What a great connection, what a great opportunity. What's been happening in a resource constrained environment, as we always are, is these programs that are being put out, hey, do this thing that's just gonna make payments. Why? What's the conservation outcome? Oh, I'm gonna be meeting with the minister before you meet with the minister to make sure that all of those things are working against our ability to provide these comprehensive conservation outcomes. So I think there needs to be more conversation between the organizations. I'll put a pitch for, we're trying to put together an Alberta Private Land Conservation Forum for exactly that purpose, to get all of the entities who are working on private land conservation. In terms of all the different incentive programs, here I'm pitching again. Tomorrow at noon, I'll be doing a webinar on a new tool we just created with the Nature Conservancy and Birds Canada called the Conservation Incentive Finder. And it's a web-based tool where a landowner can go in and figure out by clicking the boxes, it's Saskatchewan, is it rangeland, is it that kind of thing. A number of ALICE programs are in there. And we're doing an orientation about that for watershed and stewardship groups tomorrow. Land trust the next day, government agencies the next day. More of those kinds of things, more of the short sort of sharing of the information. Less of the fighting over $5 million, which $5 million is a lot of money when, you know, I look at my bank account, but when you're talking about trying to conserve natural systems across 69 million acres of land, it's not. So there's that old phrase that, you know, the egos are so big because the stakes are so low. Like, you know, we need to like just get back to thinking about what is our mandated outcome, working together. The sharing the information, share with the municipalities, share with the other organizations. I would like to see the organizations that are paying for stewardship actions and the organizations who are doing perpetual conservation get together outside of a funding conversation and say, what would look great? What would work really, really well, where you bring your strengths, I bring my strengths. Those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have, or we're just going to continue to have these ridiculous headbutting conversations over dollars.
Okay, I think that's,
That's a good place to end.
yeah, thank you so much, Guy. Really appreciate that. And we'll talk offline.
Okay.
But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very
over.
much for
Good. Online and for your great questions. And I would like to thank Ruth and Bill for bringing the snacks for tonight. It's very generous of you. Thank you. And Amy for running the computer. And if you are not a member of AWA, actually, my.
Oh,